Thank you so much, Julie. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And thank you so much for joining us. My name is Elspeth Chapman, and I've recently joined the Alliance as a strategic partnership and advocacy specialist. And I am the moderator and co-host for this session today, which is on an introduction to primary prevention for child protection in humanitarian action, based upon the position paper, which we will present shortly. Before I introduce you all to our wonderful presenters, I would like to just do some very, very quick housekeeping. So this session is 1.5 hours, and we are aiming to be as participatory as possible, which given we are such a large group is going to be challenging, but we will really try. You will have the opportunity to participate through some Mentimeter quizzes and questions, a question and answer session, as well as an exercise in some small groups. We encourage you to keep your video on if possible, okay? But we understand in some locations bandwidth might not permit, but we would really love to see your faces. On language, now please rename yourself in Zoom to tell us which language you would prefer for your breakout rooms, okay? So to do this, to change your name, go on the right, click on the 3 dots at the top right of your video and then rename, and then add either EN for Spanish, EN for English, SP for Spanish, FR for French, or AR for Arabic in front of your name, okay? This will really help us when assigning the breakout rooms. And if you have any difficulties, please message the producer in the chat and they will be able to assist you. Please note that these groups will only be formed if there are enough participants per language. And then if you do not specify your language, you will automatically go to an English-speaking room. Okay, so moving to the next slide. We are absolutely delighted to introduce our presenters for this session. So I have with me here Susan Wisniewski, Prevention Focal Point for the Alliance, as well as Selina Jensen, who's a focal point for the Assessment, Measurement and Evidence Working Group, which has actually been very much involved in the development of key prevention resources. So thank you so much to you both and a warm welcome to you. So just moving to the next slide, I'm just going to quickly highlight the objectives of this session, which essentially aim to provide you with an introduction to primary prevention, looking at what is prevention, child protection, and humanitarian action. So here we will look at the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, the importance of prevention, why it is essential and critical. We will be looking at prevention programming steps, including key actions to take across the program cycle, as well as core prevention programming elements. So before we move on, we would like to do a very, very quick icebreaker. Don't worry, we're not going to ask anyone to sing. We just want to connect with you all a little bit across this virtual space. So please, could you let us know what country you are joining from today by clicking on the link in the chat box and typing in which country you are currently from. So if the producer could put them in, here we go. The Menti link is in the chat box, so just click on this. Okay, and tell us which country you are from so we can see where you all are. Great. So between the presenters, we are in Spain, Jordan, and Canada, and we can see people are joining us from France, from Morocco, Malaysia, Sweden, Sudan, Switzerland, China, amazing, Ecuador. Fantastic. It's incredible to see through a virtual meeting how many people across so many countries are able to connect with us. So that's great. And I can see more in the chat box too. Tunisia, Oman, DRC, amazing. Fantastic. Okay. So thank you so much for taking part in that little icebreaker. Now we are going to play a video to introduce the topic of prevention, okay? And together we are going to watch Sarah's story. It really illustrates the importance of protection of the prevention of, for the protection of children in humanitarian settings. Many of our colleagues provided support in the development of this video, so an enormous thanks to you, you know who you are. And just as an aside, it has a focus on child labor as the harmful outcome for Sarah, but also has other elements of harms. So please look out for these in the video too. And okay, we can start. I think we can start the video. Thanks.
This is Sarah. She is 12 years old and lives with her family in a camp. Sarah enjoys playing with her friends and her younger brother and sister. She was attending school, but was frustrated at her poor grades. She had missed many months of school due to fighting in her town. When she did not understand something in class, Sarah stayed silent and did not ask any questions. Because there were too many children in the class, her teacher did not even notice Sarah was struggling. Some of Sarah's friends had gone to work in farms, instead of school, and Sarah decided to join them. Sarah's parents have not been able to find work. Her father had to leave his carpentry tools behind when they fled from the fighting, and he does not have enough money to rebuy the tools to start working. Not having an income makes both her father and mother very frustrated and angry. Sarah's family has to rely on irregular distributions from humanitarian agencies or help from neighbors. This is often not enough to adequately feed Sarah or her family. Sarah's parents know she is not doing well in school, but they are overwhelmed, and when she decides to stop going to school, they do not protest. Sarah spends 12 hours per day, in the rain or hot sun, working on the farm. The children are not treated well, and have been hit, if they take too long a break. Sarah also has to walk a long distance before sunrise to get to the farm each day. During her journey, she is afraid of who she may meet along the way. While Sarah may be happy to earn some money, the work makes her tired and afraid. She begins to worry about her future if she does not go back to school. Today Sarah is meeting with a community worker. The community worker is eager to connect Sarah and her family to services that may allow Sarah to return to school. But she wonders, what could have been done to prevent Sarah from experiencing child labor in the first place? What could be done to prevent other children from experiencing harm in this community? So, let's take a look at some of the opportunities to prevent Sarah from entering child labor. This is Sarah before she started working at the farm. But now, primary prevention supports have been put into place to stop child labor. People in the refugee camp realized there was a problem, and community members discussed with children, families, and humanitarian agencies about what could be done. Cash distributions were provided to all families in the camp, and her father used some of the cash to repurchase his carpentry tools. He is now busy in a workshop and has enough income to provide food for his family. Her father and her mother are less stressed with the increased income and are able to enjoy time together as a family in the evening. Sarah feels safe enough to confide in her parents that she is struggling at school, and wants to work on the farm instead. Sarah's parents have heard messages during community meetings about the difficult conditions on the farms. They talk to Sarah about how important it is that she stay in school, and while they cannot afford private tutoring, they can ensure she has a quiet space to study in the afternoon. The quality in the school has recently been improved too. Teachers' salaries were raised to an adequate level, and they receive training on participatory teaching methods. The teacher is no longer overwhelmed. When she sees Sarah is struggling, she is able to provide the extra support during the lessons. Sarah is making progress at school and enjoys working with her classmates. Child labor was a problem where Sarah lived. The community identified actions to address the main reasons for child labor, such as the lack of employment opportunities, the lack of quality education in schools, and an underestimation by families of the dangers for children working in the farms. Having supportive parents also helps Sarah cope with difficulties. These prevention efforts reached the whole community, so they not only prevented Sarah from entering child labor but many other children and families in similar situations. Humanitarian actors have a responsibility to prevent harm to children before it happens, whenever possible. The types of actions needed to prevent child labor may be different in other communities. These efforts can be carried out by child protection actors, in collaboration with others working on education, GBV, food security, or other sectors, depending on the situation. Preventing harm to children is possible. Join the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action to learn more about preventing harm to children in humanitarian settings.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it informative. I'm just gonna I want to say hello, and I'm really pleased to be with all of you on this session today on prevention. And so, well, welcome. We just saw in the video that prevention efforts, and in particular primary prevention efforts, were able to prevent harm from occurring not only to Sarah, but also to others in the community. And I just wanted to kind of restate what Elspeth had said before the video as well, is that this was an example based around child labor, but of course it could have been on dangers and injuries to children, or it could have been on preventing recruitment into armed forces and armed groups. And if it had been, the community might have identified different risk factors or root causes, or they might have identified the same. They might have taken similar actions because one risk could lead to multiple harms. So even working to prevent child labor could have prevented recruitment of children as well. So just to note that the primary prevention approaches can be used for the range of harmful outcomes to children. Okay, so we see on this screen that we're going to be looking at the definitions of primary prevention and the different levels of prevention for child protection in humanitarian action. So if we look at the triangle that's before us, we can start at the top. And this is primary prevention. So we see that this is really the widest part of the triangle because this is our biggest target group. In primary prevention, we're targeting all children in a population or in a community, whatever your population group is, we're addressing all of the children. And then we're trying to address the root causes or risk factors that's leading children to experience harm. We're also going to want to identify protective factors. So that is helping to prevent that harm from happening and strengthening those. But the main characteristic to keep in mind for primary prevention is that we're working with the whole population of children. So this is inclusive of the most vulnerable, but it's also all children regardless if they are currently at a high risk for harm or not. And so we saw in the video, for example, that a lack of quality education was one of the risk factors leading children to harmful child labor. If we were, for example, we could identify high-risk children and we could have provided extra tutoring for them to stay in school. But in this example, what happened is that the intervention was to raise the quality of education in the whole school and maybe in other schools as well. So every student benefited, and even children who would come into that school later would also benefit. So it was a population intervention or primary prevention. So if we go down to the second level, this is secondary prevention. And this, you can see it's a smaller part of the triangle because it's a smaller target group. So we're looking specifically at groups of children who are at high risk for harmful outcomes. So this can be because of a specific risk factor. It can be because of a vulnerability. We've identified that they're more likely to experience harm. So we're going to target this group specifically. And this is where a lot of our programming for child protection and humanitarian action sits. We're working with high-risk children. And then if we go to the bottom layer, which I know is small writing, it's a little bit hard to see. This is tertiary prevention. And here, again, it's a smaller part of the triangle because it's very specific target group. This is individual children who have already experienced harm. So here we're providing immediate support and remedial support to those children, but we also want to make sure that the long-term impact of what has happened to them is mitigated or reduced. And of course, we also want to make sure that harm does not happen again. And that's what should have been written on the bottom of that square, so apologies for that mistake. And so these are the 3 levels of prevention. And it would be great if later today in the next session, on the thematic sessions, including all through the week, when you're listening to the speakers talk about their different approaches and programs, try to consider, is this primary prevention? Is it secondary? Is it tertiary? Where does it fit? And maybe it's even a mix of 2. And this will help give us a way to classify the different types of interventions and see how we can try to also move into primary prevention. Okay, so what we're going to do now is challenge our understanding of the 3 levels, and we're going to do a quick quiz. So this quiz is called, Is This an Example of Primary Prevention? It's a very, very catchy title, I know. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a scenario, and then you are going to decide, yes, this is an example of primary prevention, or no, this is not an example of primary prevention. So there will be the link in the chat that you can go to, and it's going to give you the first scenario. Okay. And it's written very smallly, so you can see it's written in the 4 languages. You can try to read the language that you prefer, but I will also read it out loud. And then you can vote yes or no, and your responses are anonymous. So if you vote yes, we'll just see how many people voted yes, how many people voted no, and I see you're already voting. So I'm going to go ahead and read the scenario. For those who maybe can't read it on the screen there. So in this first scenario, the community group is conducting life skills sessions for child survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. The aim is to improve the sense of community belonging and self-confidence, which were identified as protective factors that help prevent sexual violence. So I'll wait a moment for everyone to go ahead and vote. Okay. All right. So I hope most of you have had time to vote. And so, all right, so most of us are saying no. And that is, let's see the correct answer. Does it come up? Yes, okay, so it's no. So the answer is no. Why? Because this intervention was targeting specifically children who are survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, so who already experienced harm, which makes this an example of tertiary prevention. So well done to those of you who got it correct. All right, so let's go to the second example. Okay, so here's the scenario. A lack of access to schools and cultural norms around marriages were identified during an assessment as risk factors for child marriage. Programming is in place to expand existing secondary schools and organize discussions with religious and government authorities about early marriage practices. So is this an example of primary prevention, yes or no? Gosh, some of you are very quick. And don't be influenced by the vote you already see.
No.
Give everyone a chance to go ahead and put their vote in. Okay. We've got some in the chat as well. Perfect. Okay. All right, so it looks like most of us are saying yes, and that would be the correct answer. All right, so yes, this is an example of primary prevention because it was targeting all children of that age group in terms of the intervention that was being put into place. So yes, it was an example of primary prevention. All right, so we can go to the next question. Okay, so this one, third question. A new project is starting up that will provide a series of cash distributions to households where children were identified as being at high risk of recruitment into armed forces and armed groups. Is this an example of primary prevention? Okay, this time you can go ahead and think about it and then put your answer in. Okay, I'm seeing the responses in the chat as well. Okay, I think most people have had time to vote. So we can go ahead and reveal the answer. No, okay, most people got it correct. Yes, no. Why? Because again, this intervention was specifically targeting children who were at risk of recruitment into armed forces and armed groups. That would make it an example of secondary prevention. Still prevention, but secondary prevention. All right, you guys are really good at this. We're going to do the last question. Okay, so the last and final question. Physical and emotional maltreatment of children within their homes was found to be a major problem. Public service messages with information on how to access family support services available within the community, including parent support groups, were disseminated. So is this an example of primary prevention? So you can answer in the link. And if you're answering in the chat, let's see if we can keep our streak. Okay, all right. Everyone's had time to vote. We can go to the answer. Dun, dun, dun. Yes, okay. So again, yes, this was an example of primary prevention because the messages were accessible to all families, all children within the population. Even if they didn't take advantage of the services, they were available. So that's why this is an example of primary prevention. Well done. You guys have got the 3 levels of prevention down. Very impressive. All right, so I hope those were helpful in providing some illustrations of the 3 different levels. And I'm now going to hand over to Selena, who's going to talk about the importance of primary prevention. So over to you, Selena.
Thanks, Susan, and hi, everybody. First, I'd like to pose the question to all of you. So if you could click on the link that's going to be in the chat, there'll be another Mentimeter question, which poses why is primary prevention important? So if you can all click on that and enter your responses. Yes, I see some of you have been reading the position paper. Cost efficient, ethical, great, respects children's rights, the entire community, empowerment of the community, targets population, safety, again linked to keeping children safe. So I think kind of the biggest response that looks like in the middle, there's ethical, prevents harm before it occurs, builds trust. Yeah, that's a great one. Protection of the entire family. greater impact? Okay, thanks for those responses. It's getting too big for me to read anymore, so that's great. So I'd like to touch specifically on two of those. As we can see from all of those varied responses, primary prevention specifically is important for many different reasons. But I want to touch on two that were mentioned. So the ethical responsibility as well as the cost effectiveness of primary prevention. So as Susan mentioned, primary prevention seeks not only to prevent an individual child from experiencing harm, but also to reduce the risk of harm for all children within a population. So the goal of primary prevention is really to reduce the overall number of children experiencing harm, which complements case level response actions that we often implement. So primary prevention achieves this by really recognizing the centrality of children's health and well-being, and does this in accordance to each of the levels of the socio-ecological model. And this is really important because we, as you have all highlighted, have an ethical responsibility to prevent harm before it occurs. And this is also highlighted in the minimum standards for child protection, as well as the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, really the guiding principles around do no harm and best interests. So if we're truly to uphold these principles, we have a responsibility to prevent harm before it occurs. And during humanitarian crises, it's neither ethical nor in the best interests of the child to wait for harm that is preventable to occur before we take action. So implementing primary prevention approaches that aim to reduce risk factors and promote protective factors alongside case level response actions or second and tertiary preventive approaches will ultimately improve the ability of children and families and communities to cope with or adapt to adverse experiences. So the second point that was really highlighted relates to the cost effectiveness of primary prevention. And what we mean by cost effectiveness is really in reference to comparisons of both the financial costs of different programs, as well as the resulting outcomes of those programs as measured by indicators of children's well-being. So as we're all aware, the child protection humanitarian sector is underfunded. In general, there is limited evidence and comparative work on the cost effectiveness of child protection programs in humanitarian settings in general, and most specifically on preventive approaches. However, evidence from other sectors such as public health and education support the claim that primary prevention is indeed cost effective. So a framework of action for primary prevention will really provide child protection agencies with a structure by which to evaluate and compare the outcomes of prevention initiatives. And this body of comparative work will improve the evidence base, as well as result in better outcomes for children over time, and hopefully encourage further investment in primary prevention efforts. So the aim is really to move away from the question we often pose when there's a humanitarian crisis, which is what are the harmful outcomes or risks to children occurring in this context, to really inquiring and taking action on what are the risk and protective factors that are causing or driving these harmful outcomes to occur, and how can we address the risk factors while also promoting and strengthening the protective factors. And in this, by reducing the need for responsive action, primary prevention has both notable ethical and cost benefits. So I'll stop there and back over to you, Susan.
Okay, thanks a lot, Selena. All right, so we're going to turn to look at how we can do primary prevention programming. And to start, I'm going to ask you a question. And the question is very simple. It's in your scope of work today. Are you currently working on primary prevention for child protection in your programming? So there should be a link in the chat that you can go ahead and click. It'll take you to the Mentimeter poll and you can just answer yes or no. Are you currently working on primary prevention programming? And this can be directly or it can be in a supporting role as well. So let's see. All right, I see some are responding in the chat, some in the Mentimeter. Okay. All right, I am really impressed that there are so many of us working on primary prevention today, and that's fantastic. That's really exciting. And it'll be great over the rest of this week and even later in this session when we go into breakout rooms to hear more on your work and your experiences. So that's really fantastic to see that we've had so many people in the room working on primary prevention already. All right, so thank you very much. And now we're going to turn to speak about the development of the framework of action for primary prevention for child protection and humanitarian action that Selena mentioned. And the framework is still in development, but of course it's based on the key elements and the key steps that are outlined in the position paper that was shared with you. So it's going to build from that piece of work. And the objective of the prevention framework is to provide guidance for humanitarians. Sorry, let me just move this over. For humanitarian workers on the key actions and considerations to apply in programming to prevent harm to children in humanitarian settings. So to make this easy to apply, the framework is going to use the steps of the program management cycle. And this is the model for program management that you can find in Standard 4 of the Child Protection Minimum Standards. And for each of the 5 steps of the cycle, there will be key actions and considerations that are particularly important for primary prevention programming. You might also do them for other prevention or response programming, but they're really the essentials to do for primary prevention programming. So we can see on the next slide a bit of an overview of the program cycle and some of the key actions. So the framework is of course going to go into more detail, but I just wanted to highlight one important element here. So if you look at the first step, which is preparedness in this kind of bright green, you're going to see that the first step is understand risk and protective factors and existing needs and capacities. It has additional actions, so include primary prevention in preparedness plans and strengthen prevention services pre-crisis. So it's stronger when the crisis does occur. And then if we look at the second step, which is needs assessment and situation analysis, we're going to see that we're going to assess harmful outcomes, and we're also going to assess their related risk and protective factors within communities or with communities. So what we're seeing is that understanding risk and protective factors is really going to underpin and is the foundation of primary prevention programming. I just wanted to pause also to say what are risk and protective factors. So risk factors are going to be the root causes, and they can be external threats, they can be vulnerabilities, anything that is making the likelihood of harm happening to a child increase. So for example, in the video with Sarah, we saw that a loss of livelihoods was a risk factor for children experiencing or getting into harmful child labor. So that's an example of a risk factor. And then on the other side, we have protective factors, which are the opposite. Protective factors are going to decrease the likelihood that a child will experience harm. And so these protective factors or capacities can occur in all levels. So it could be within the individual child, with their family, with community, within the society, you can find protective factors. So for example, a child that has a strong friendship group or peer group might help protect them from mental health problems or psychosocial distress. Or the capacity of a community, the ability for them to have a dialogue with armed actors could help them negotiate prevention of child recruitment. So that could be another protective factor. But understanding the risk and protective factors and understanding the priority factors with communities is really essential. So knowing which risk factors are going to have the greatest impact on harm occurring, which protective factors are going to have the most impact on preventing harm, is going to underpin everything you do in the other steps of the program cycle. So in step 3, it's going to influence your design. What are your objectives going to be? What change are you trying to make? What approach are you going to select? That all goes back to the specific risk and protective factors that were assessed and understood. So on that note, I am going to hand it back over to Selena, who's going to talk about an approach on identifying risk and ranking risk and protective factors with community members. So over to you, Selena.
Thanks, Susan. So I wanted to talk about a methodology that was developed or adapted by the Alliance last year, as well as a pilot example and some of the results from the piloting last year. So since primary prevention is characterized by intervening before the occurrence of a harmful outcome, it's of course essential that preventive efforts be grounded, as Susan mentioned, in an understanding of the risk factors at each level of the socio-ecological model that lead to a harmful outcome or cause or drive a harmful outcome, as well as the protective factors that help to outweigh the risk factors or bolster against them. So last year, the Alliance developed some guidance around which describes the use of a participative listing and ranking methodology to identify and better understand risk and protective factors in context. And I believe there's a link to the guide that is going to be placed in the chat now. So I really encourage you to look that up at some point, and it's a really useful document, and engage and use the document in your own work. So in general, assessing vulnerability to a harmful child protection outcome for prevention programming is challenging, since the causal mechanisms and pathways to each specific harmful outcome are diverse and complex. So this methodology aims to identify and list risk and protective factors, as well as rank them in a participatory manner. And this is done through focus group discussions with community members, children, caregivers, and other relevant stakeholders within the community, or actors such as child protection actors or other sector actors. This methodology really aims to identify and understand the risk factors associated with specific harmful outcomes, as well as the protective factors, so that those can be strengthened. And this will also help to lead to the establishment of criteria for better identifying children who may be at risk or higher risk of specific harmful outcomes in order to prevent harm before it occurs. So the number of times that each risk or protective factor is mentioned within these focus group discussions is really less important than kind of the overall risk and protective factors that are mentioned. So each group that participates, we have each group participating separately based on the assumption that different risk and protective factors might be mentioned or prioritized in different groups. So an example of that is at times children might mention substance misuse occurring in the family, whereas this could be downplayed by adults who are participating in a focus group discussion. So having separate focus group discussions with all these different groups of individuals within the community really gives a bigger picture of all of the risk and protective factors that exist. So a deeper understanding of the risk and protective factors will really lead to the improved design of programmatic interventions, as Susan mentioned, the prioritization of appropriate responses, including strengths-based practices. We often in the child protection humanitarian sector focus on responding to problems as opposed to really working with communities and children to identify protective factors that can be strengthened and built upon, as well as the identification of children and families for program inclusion in a cost and time efficient manner, the identification of existing mechanisms that care for and protect children, again, at the community level, and over time, the reassessment and monitoring of risk and protective factors. So importantly, this methodology helps to identify protective factors that may not be visible or are often not considered when we take a more deficits-based or problem-oriented approach. And this might include the importance of friendships and peer relationships, nuanced considerations of caregiver-child relationships or community-child relationships that all play an essential role in preventing harm to children. So now I'll just speak very briefly about the pilot in Armenia. So this methodology was piloted last year. It was intended to be piloted alongside some other work the AIM working group was facilitating in Nagorno-Karabakh by World Vision and one of their local partners, PRISM. This occurred last November, and just the weekend before the pilot was meant to take place, the conflict escalated in Nagorno-Karabakh, which resulted in 60% of the population being displaced into Armenia. So we had to modify the pilot somewhat since it was an on-set emergency situation. World Vision led a multi-sector needs assessment. And through this assessment, it was identified that child maltreatment had increased. There was several other potential harmful outcomes for children, such as recruitment and child labor. But the increase in child maltreatment was really highlighted during the needs assessment. So we piloted the participative listing and ranking methodology in Yerevan with focus groups with children. These were split between boys and girls, as well as their caregivers, primarily mothers, because the men were still in Nagorno-Karabakh involved in the conflict, and then child protection actors. And these focus group discussions really sought to identify the risk and protective factors. So just to very briefly summarize some of the key findings and outcomes of this pilot, of course, there were many different risk and protective factors that were identified by the different groups, but just to summarize, they included, of course, the displacement, psychosocial distress, unmet basic needs. Many of the children, especially the younger children, believed that the increase in physical and emotional punishment was a result of their own misconduct and poor behavior. They didn't understand that it was maybe a reaction due to the increased stress of their caregivers. Nearly all of the protective factors that were identified that had existed prior to the escalation in conflict, such as access to school, the existence of recreational activities and friends, the sense of community, access to livelihoods, safety and security, being around family and neighbors, had all eroded. The one key protective factor that remained was the caregiver-child relationship, that children were still with their primary caregivers. However, in this situation, it was actually the primary caregivers that were also responsible for the increase in child maltreatment, which is an important finding to highlight. So again, just to summarize, World Vision was able to adapt their programming. Almost immediately, they took action to make changes to their programming that were more designed and very specific to what was mentioned by the children caregivers. In this context, we didn't interview or have focus group discussions with community members just because of the displacement context. So World Vision immediately implemented activities with caregivers and older children. They had some activities in place with younger children under the age of 5, and safe places for them to come together with their caregivers. But this wasn't existing for older children. And what came out of the focus group discussions was really that older children felt that their caregivers weren't as responsive to them. So World Vision adapted their programming to allow for activities. And since this was just in the lead up to the holidays, that was easy to put in place. So there was activities related to the holiday season. There was increased coordination with MHPSS colleagues. Support groups for caregivers were started. This was something that was mentioned by caregivers during the focus group discussions, that it was a sense of relief, even during the focus group discussions, to be able to come together and express some of the stressors that were occurring. World Vision trained psychologists to work with caregivers around stressors, and there was activities that were included that involved grandmothers. At the time, it was mentioned that grandmothers were taking on more of a role, and they hadn't been previously included in programming with World Vision. And that was due to the increase in stress of the mothers and inability to care for the children. There was also a spiritual aspect, and local priests were engaged to also have meetings with children and caregivers. And then there was the integration of displaced children in education in the local dialect, and awareness campaigns related to child labor, because that was a concern that children would start working due to the loss of employment and livelihoods. So I'll stop there. I'm going to hand over to Elspeth. And if you have any questions, we'll take a few questions, and I'll do my best to answer those questions in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Selena. So a couple of questions have come up in the chat box. So I'm going to read, 2 questions have come up, so I'm going to read them out. So the first question is from our colleague Hamid from the Red Crescent, who is asking, how do you think it is possible to engage families, caregivers, and children in identifying risks to children? Oh, no, sorry, that's not the right question. He's asking, sorry, risk is a combination of exposure, vulnerability, and severity of hazard. According to that, how do you consider these factors when identifying risk? So would you like me to repeat the question?
No, I
It's
think
okay.
that's a great question. And yes, you've really pinpointed kind of also aspects we haven't talked about, which is severity and exposure. I think going back to the methodology, this is a very simple methodology that was developed precisely because it is the accumulation of risk factors and the erosion of protective factors that lead to any given harmful outcome. So we often look at as monetary poverty as being a risk factor, but of course there are many families that are poor whose children don't engage in child labor and do not separate or engage or become recruited. So we really need to look at what all of the risk factors are that accumulate together in addition to the erosion of protective factors to really have programs that will prevent harm to children. And within that, looking at the exposure and severity of those risk factors. So I hope that has identified or kind of not so much answered your question, but more in agreement with that. Really some key. The Alliance also published a report last year which speaks to this in more detail. So I would encourage you all to review that, and we'll send the link to that as well shortly.
Okay, so there's a few questions coming in now. So we just keep going until our time allotted is up. So our colleague Jonas was asking us, how do you think it's possible to engage families, caregivers, and children in identifying risks, given the current context of COVID-19? And do we have any good practices to share in this regard?
Yeah, that's another great point and very important to highlight. This was something we needed to consider during the pilot as well. So really, I think it will come down to each context and what the public health measures are that are in place. I can speak to the pilot specifically. Of course, in the lead up, we weren't sure with the situation with COVID how to adapt the methodology. So it was really something that we had to consider. At that time in Armenia, groups were able to meet with up to 8 people. So we had kind of a smaller number of individuals in the focus groups and respected the public government mandated public health measures. So I think it really is a case by case basis in terms of the context. I think in many contexts, you can meet with a smaller group of people as long as there's social distancing in place and public health measures are respected.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think we can squeeze one more in. Our colleague Sophia is asking whether you define an intervention as primary prevention if the entire population is at risk, or whether this would be classified as secondary prevention.
If it's I guess it would depend on the risk level. So I'm assuming it's at low risk. So in this case, it would be a primary prevention. That's a great question.
Yeah, there's some really great questions coming up. So maybe we will do the last question that's come up. So Katie is asking, she would be interested to know what training and support was provided to the facilitators conducting their focus group discussions to gain such a rich and contextual understanding of strengths and risks at both the adult and the child level? So another great question.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up because that's something I didn't mention. So we had a training with the World Vision team, and they had engaged with social workers or caseworkers that were working with the children. So it was actually the social workers who facilitated the focus group discussions. They also had with the children a psychologist who was present. So they were individuals who had a lot of experience working on child protection issues already. And so in this sense, we facilitated a training on the methodology itself with all of those individuals prior to the focus groups taking place, but had identified individuals who were really experienced with working with children as well as in the context.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much for those questions. And I can also see that Hani put some response to Hamid's question in the chat as well. So thank you so much. So moving quickly now into our next exercise, we're actually going to do some group work with 232 participants. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go into groups of 5 or 6 people for 10 minutes. And after this very short explanation, you will be assigned into your groups based upon language if possible. Okay, so in your group, can you agree on one harmful outcome for children that can be experienced in humanitarian settings? And in your group, can you discuss what are some of the risk factors as well as protective factors related to this outcome? So just to clarify, when we are specifying harmful outcomes, think about the child protection risks outlined in pillar 2 of the minimum standards. For example, as we've seen, child labor in Sarah's story. Okay, so think about dangers and injuries. Think about some of the, think about a harmful outcome. And then risk factors. So here the root causes that are increasing the likelihood of this harmful outcome. So as we saw in the Armenia case study, it was related to displacement. It can be related to inability to meet basic needs. And finally, the protective factors. So the protective factors to decrease this likelihood. And we've seen examples of the relationship between children and their caregivers, friendship, access to quality education. So have a think about these as well. So the question will also be posted again in the chat box, so you'll be able to see this during your group work. So we just need you at this point just to have a discussion. Time is quite short, so if you could just jump in and start, that'd be fantastic. And then I'll hand over now to the producer to set up the breakout rooms, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Susan, do you want to kick us back off?
Sure, great. Okay. All right, welcome back to most of you. I hope you had some interesting discussions and fun discussions in your groups. Now we're just going to do a little bit of feedback from what you talked about in the chat. Can I ask if some of you would be happy just to write in the chat, what harmful outcome did you choose to talk about in your group? And we're going to pick one of the harmful outcomes to look at in plenary. If anyone wants to write in the chat, what did you talk about? So I see recruitment. Thank you, Faith. Bullying, child labor, sexual abuse, separation, SGBV, child labor, trafficking. Okay. I'm glad there was good diversity of topics. All right. So, I think I see separation a few times. So I'm going to go with family separation. So now what we're going to do is think about family separation, whether you talked about it in your group or not, but you might have some overlapping risk and protective factors. And we're going to go again to a Mentimeter. So you're going to go to the link in the poll, and it's going to ask you, and I'm going to ask you, what are some of the potential risk factors for family separation? And so this could be something you discussed in your group. It could be something that you've experienced in your own work or in different contexts that you have been in. Okay, so we've got violence in the home leading to separation, lack of income, food insecurity. So a lot around, economics, poverty, displacement could also lead to secondary displacement. Child labor will force family separation, emotional distress, sexual abuse, a lot of different factors, exploitation. We've got lack of livelihoods a few times along with poverty. Yeah, there's a great variety of risk factors, mental health, bereavement, PTSD. It's a really interesting map to look at because you can see there's so many different factors that might exist in one context, but wouldn't exist in another context. So the reasons that children might be separated from their family would be very different in one place to another, which is why it's so important to really look at the specific reasons in the context. Very interesting, thank you. All right, so if we go to the second question, I don't know if this is a new link or we stay on the same link, but we're gonna look at protective factors. So what are protective factors that would help prevent family separation? So you can go ahead and write your answers and we'll get the brainstorm again of all the different protective factors you could have to prevent family separation. So given the variety of risk factors, I bet there will be a big variety of protective factors as well. So access to services, education, community sensibilization. So what might be the risks? Sport and play, economic strengthening, family tracing mechanisms. I like that community is really in the center there, that the community can really be a protective factor. And I also see family. So family and including extended family. And so family counseling, early warning systems, legal assistance, strong family ties, psychosocial support, legal framework. There's a whole host of protective factors that could be addressed. Awareness, informing children. So we can really see there's protective factors at every level of the socio-ecological model that could possibly be important protective factors. All right. Okay, great. You came up with a lot of different risk and protective factors just for one issue. And that's why it's really important to make sure that we're contextualizing, understanding what are the specific risk and protective factors within a context, and then also what are the most important. So if we address, building up supportive communities, or is it sensitization, or is it economic strengthening? What's going to have the most impact on preventing harm and working with communities to identify what those would be the major impacts. All right, so thanks a lot for your discussions and then bringing all of this brainstorming back to us. I'm going to hand it back over to Elspeth now. Oh no, I'm sorry. I think I'm going to hand it over to Selena, my apologies, who's going to talk about another part of the background paper, the core elements. So over to you, Selena.
Thanks, Susan, and great to see so many responses in the Mentimeter. One thing that I find interesting and is that a lot of what was being raised, you can see how often it's not just one child protection risk or harmful outcome, often they are correlated with one another. So we see, I think MHPSS was mentioned, and recruitment. So we can see all of those different harmful outcomes that we often kind of think about as separate, actually are correlated to, in this example, separation. Just before I start talking about the kind of core elements of the prevention framework, I believe in the chat, or can we put some documents in the chat if they weren't already in? So we had developed, in addition to the guidance document I spoke about earlier, also a brief, which kind of highlights different measures that can be used to identify risk and protective factors. And I just wanted to add one more resource, since Hamid, you had asked the question around exposure as well, and to highlight, so this is a report I just put into the link. Within all three of these documents that we have sent around, last year we had done a couple different desk reviews to really look at documented risk and protective factors. And through that, not just within the child protection sector, but within child developmental science, resilience research, MHPSS. And we found that there were kind of common risk and protective factors that we see within many different disciplines and sectors. So within these documents, you'll find what we have kind of referred to as universal or common risk and protective factors. These, of course, need to be contextualized in each specific context, but I would encourage you to look at those resources. In the report that I had just highlighted, we also specified specific guidance around the accumulation of risk factors, as well as severity and exposure. And what we mean by that is, in terms of severity, the length of time a child might be exposed to violence, for instance, as well as the proximity. So if there's a child, an armed group in close proximity to a community, children might be at greater risk of recruitment, for example, than if the armed group was further away. So it really provides additional guidance. And in addition to that, makes mention of how each of these risk factors also needs to be taken into consideration, the different ages and stages of a child's development, because of course, programming may be different in accordance to the age and stage of development. So I just wanted to make mention of that as well. And then last but not least, the core programming elements that have been identified with the support of the Prevention Initiatives Advisory Group members. These really are related to, again, being context specific, looking at each of the levels of the socio-ecological model, multi-sectoral collaboration, strengthening protective factors, so not just responding to risks, as we've reiterated throughout this presentation, and then strategically maximizing results, which is really in reference to looking at the age and stage of development and having targeted programming around that. Facilitating community ownership, being child-centered and inclusive, and then working across both the development and humanitarian systems. So I'll stop there, and I think hand back over to you, Susan and Elspeth.
Great, thank you so much. So as you can see, our session is about to come to an end. So before you leave, we'd really like to get some feedback from you. Please note your responses will be anonymous. So we'd love it if you could click on the link and share one thought or question on prevention that you are taking away from this session. So something that you would really like to explore over this week or in your own work. Why is there no funding for this important work? More on designing prevention interventions, getting a better grip on the understanding of the different prevention levels, multi-sectoral integration. And actually, there are some specific thematic sessions on that this week. Prevention in contexts where the law is not available or enforced, more around identifying risk and protective factors, tools for prevention programming, using the focus group discussion tool that was presented in this session as a starting point for intervention. Great, fantastic. Thank you so much for this feedback. How to generate more evidence. Okay.
Can I just speak to the first one that came up was that I read was around children's views on the risks. And of course, it's important to engage with children, such as in the example of the methodology we spoke about earlier, to really get the perspectives of children of what is causing and leading to the harm. And I think the point I raised earlier about the children in the Armenia pilot context, the younger children who actually believed that they were being punished because of their own misconduct and misbehavior, is particularly heartbreaking, because the children didn't understand that it was actually, a result of the situation and stress. And so it's really important to not only understand from their perspectives what is causing the harm, but then also to have programming in place that can help them understand that they have not done anything wrong. So it was an interesting perspective to include them and hear that as well, and really important. So really highlights the importance of engaging with children on many different levels. I just wanted to add that.
Great, thanks. Okay, so thank you so much for joining and participating in this session. We really hope that it's been interesting and informative, and has clearly set out some of the key concepts, definitions, and steps for primary prevention in child protection and humanitarian action. And please do reflect on these in all the sessions this week. We would like to remind you and encourage you to read the position paper on primary prevention if you haven't had the chance to do so already. And as Selena pointed out, there are further resources on prevention, which can be found on the Alliance's Prevention Initiative webpage. There will now be a 5-minute break between sessions, which will allow you time to select and join the thematic session of your choice for the final session of the day. So thank you again so much. We hope you enjoyed the session.